All of 1940 and 41 were times of tension because in Europe, Germany and Italy had had great success in overcoming countries, and the United States was very concerned that if war should break out, they wanted to be prepared. How they knew anything about Japanese threat, I do not know, except Japan had entered Manchuria and conquered that country, and perhaps they said the threat is also on the Pacific. But they were prepared at Pearl Harbor to make those arrests. The question is something about what were some of the legal rationales for the internment. And I don't have a definitive answer, but the attitudes of the military decision makers affected how these decisions were made. But justification, it was all had to do with the war effort and military necessities. Because some of the Army personnel that were in charge of this decision making, one was quoted as saying, if they have just 1/16 Japanese blood, they're a Jap, and they should go to the camps. And they had an orphanage in one of the camps where they took care of some 60 children who were orphans or foster children. Yes?
So that means that they were afraid of some kind of espionage might happen just on the West Coast. So just the West Coast Asians were incarcerated?
And yes, and the persons in the other part of the United States were not affected at all. Yes. The question is, how about the Germans and Italian Americans? Were they treated differently because they were white rather than being able to look different than the Japanese Americans? As far as German American citizens and Italian American citizens, as far as I know, none of them went to internment camps.
At all.
Okay, this person is relating a story about a German American who was born in the United States and served in the Army as a translator.
Was right, but they weren't interned, but he suffered discrimination and fear of what might happen with him.
Okay, so the Japanese at Topaz, and there were signs of discrimination and harassment, like a truckload of workers going out to the agricultural fields. You have to dismount each person and look at their pass individually and then load back up before you could go out to the field. There were others that were treated fairly, so it's a mixed bag. The question is, was the person that was murdered at Topaz or shot and killed by the sentry, was the family ever compensated? The answer is no. And I think he was a single person, so whether he had an intact family, I don't know. The sentry that shot him was put on court-martial, but acquitted of any wrong action. But that was one of the crises at Topaz, because the persons thought, is the penalty for getting too close to the fence death? The question was, how many persons, Japanese Americans, were in the camp? It was around 8,000.
Whoa.
Wow, that's a big city.
The largest camp was Tule Lake, 15,000 people. The question was, were the apartments crowded? When you have 4 people in a 20 by 20 foot room,
That's crowded.
and 4 beds,
Wow.
it's getting crowded already. And then if you set up a little closet area, maybe a little table to put things on, chairs, It was pretty crowded in those rooms. Well, the 20 by 20 was probably 3 or 4. If they had large families, 5 or 6, maybe they'd get 24 feet by 20 foot apartment. If they had a very large family, maybe 7 or 8 children, they would have maybe 2 apartments assigned to them. The Bell family had a whole half a barracks for our 6.
This incarceration, I mean, yeah, they rounded people up, well, you know, it's gonna be over sometime.
Kind of like now.
Okay, the question is, did the government or did the administration have any reassurances to the incarcerees? They were called evacuees. That seemed to be the name that was given to those who were not part of the Caucasian administration. They had the administration and the evacuees. Well, no one knew, administrators, government, the president, no one knew what would happen after the war. And so all throughout the war experience at Topaz, there were no reassurances. You will be able to go back home. You will be able to get your property back. No one knew what the answers were. But as the war went on and people started relocating to the East Coast, to Chicago, New York, wherever they could find a position and move their families there, they were on a whole new destiny. They had sort of given up on the idea of going back. Ultimately, some did leave their jobs in the East Coast and come back to California after the war. But there were no reassurances. And that's a mixed question. Some did and some didn't. Some had correspondence with that neighbor who said, I'll take care of your strawberry harvest. And they'd keep in touch, and he would set aside some of the money that was received for the crop in their account, in their bank account. Others had no idea whether they would find their property intact, whether their belongings would be ransacked, whether their house would be burned. They could only find that out after they returned. With each family, probably a different story. Some people owned property, and they sold it quickly, as quickly as they could, when they knew that they were going to be removed from that territory. Others had neighbors who they were friends, and they said, we'll take care of your property while you're gone. Some did and some didn't. Other people decided never to go back to their California, Oregon, Washington homesteads or property. They settled elsewhere in the United States. So there's a whole variety of answers.
With us.
Now that was very important because they needed to have a sponsor where they were going. It could be a friend or a relative who would vouch for their honesty and integrity and help them get settled in a new situation. It was reported that some persons after World War II had no idea what they were going to do, and they committed suicide or drank gasoline. Some of you have read the book Stubborn Twig about the Yasui family of Hood River, and the Issei person, the head of the household, ended up committing suicide in his old age. They don't know if he had dementia or what it was, but that was how he ended his life after World War II. Yes?
Do you know of people or groups of Japanese Americans who resisted? And if they resisted, what happened to them?
One was a test case for the Supreme Court. His name was Minoru Yasui, was one who tested the curfew. A curfew was imposed upon Japanese Americans from 8 o'clock at night until 6 in the morning. Minoru Yasui was a law student at University of Oregon, graduated, and then went to Portland to set up a law practice. And he said, I'm going to test that curfew. I'm a citizen of the United States. I was born in Hood River, Oregon. And so he went out on the streets waiting to be arrested. But nobody paid any attention to him, so he went into the police department and said, I demand to be arrested. And the officer said, go back home. But his case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and he lost that case because the Supreme Court said during war, some of our civil rights have to be set aside because of that war involvement. Well, thank you. The person is asking, what about our personal relationships with schoolmates and so forth? And that's a perfect introduction to Winnie. That's what she said.
We got there in early September, and most of the buildings were not completed, but school was going to start, and that was in early October, I believe. And the first day of registration, I was starting the 4th grade. I went to Block 8, where Mountain View Elementary School was, to register. I went in the door, and the room was bare, except benches around the walls and this pot-bellied stove and a small table and chairs for the teacher. I was sitting there, feeling very alone when all these Japanese children were there. They all looked alike to me because I'd never seen so many all together. And I was sitting by myself feeling very out of place when this little girl came up to me and she said, "Oh, I'm so glad to see you. I've never seen so many Japs in my life." That was Hoshiko Hidakawa. She was my best friend. There were no supplies for the teacher to use. They had to really be ingenious to teach us. But we went by California standards and got a good education. Sooner or later we had blackboards, and we had more books than just a few. We wrote compositions, and when I went to a reunion in San Francisco in 1988, I was surprised to read one of my compositions on the blackboard that they had, and my teacher, Florence Date Smith, was there. So it was very nice. We had Japanese American teachers sometimes, and sometimes Hakujin ones. One important place for everyone to have as a center of time and effort is the art school. First started in Tanforan, the racing track, by Mr. Obata. And he knew that people needed something to do. So you could go and learn how to arrange flowers, paint, draw, and it was a good thing to have some kind of normalcy. We found out that the people could make beauty out of nothing. There wasn't even sagebrush growing there, mostly greasewood and rabbit brush. And they'd take these sticks and make artificial flowers and the most beautiful arrangements. Frequently, there were only 3 flowers for heaven, earth, and man, and then foliage in there. They could make all kinds of things out of nothing. When they were tearing down Tule Lake Camp, some workman saw that beautiful thing on a wall of an apartment, and he had the forethought to save it. And we found it in a second-hand store in Klamath Falls, and brought it home, and It is crumbling at the bottom. It's just on wallboard, on the sheetrock. And it was crumbling on the bottom, so we had it framed so it wouldn't fall apart further. But I think the expression on her hair, on our face is so sad. I think it showed how the people felt inside. They never said anything, but that must have been how a lot of the people felt during this experience. But I think she's beautiful. They had classes for the adults in flower arranging, English, sewing, lapidary work, accounting, cooking, shell pins and crafts, and business and other things too. The older kids later on got chances to play sports, football and basketball with the neighboring towns, maybe baseball too, I don't know. I remember Easter sunrise service. There was a stark, empty cross on a vacant lot and no foliage growing. And then on Easter Sunday, somebody had put the most beautiful artificial lilies all up that cross, and it was the most beautiful thing that you ever saw with the rising sun. And we went to the Protestant church there, and the first time we went, Mom asked one of the ladies, "Is it all right if we come?" And her name was Amy Kajawara, and she said, "Mrs. Bell, the church is for everyone." There was a big agriculture program that our dad was involved in. The soil was very poor. They found out that 70% of the soil was not farmable. It was so bad. 30% they could leach out the salts and put in salt grass and get some kind of crops sooner or later. Later on, they could get passes to the mountains, and they'd go in cattle trucks with a bushel basket and get a bushel basket of good soil so they could grow something, because they couldn't grow anything on the soil at Topaz. By the third summer, they raised most of their vegetables for the dining rooms. They had enough food, but the Issei were all used to having Oriental food available, which wasn't available there until one of the ag workers showed initiative and started a bean sprout growing part, and also they made tofu, which helped the seniors a lot. We didn't eat in the dining room. We were a family of 6, and we couldn't afford, Hakujins had to pay for their meals. And so they got an old wood range, and Mom, it had 3 legs, and Mom cooked on that, and they got a picnic table from somewhere, and we'd carry our dishes over to the laundry room and do dishes afterwards in a bucket, I remember. And so we didn't know what they ate in the dining rooms too much. I think our older brother ate in a dining room once with a friend, and then he was told he wasn't supposed to.
You were not allowed into the living quarters?
Yeah, we had the wrong color hair and skin.
And nobody talked to you about that your friends?
I don't know that we really asked that question. We were kids. You know, kids do dumb things.
Yeah, no, I get it. And any feedback about the quality or quantity of the food?
And food supplied 3 times a day at the dining hall, and then they could live in these apartments. Each block had their own dining hall and their own set of cooks that were employed by the project to do the cooking. Sometimes they were skilled in cooking Japanese food, and sometimes they were skilled in cooking American food. And so the quality varied in every block, had a different kind of food service. And so some of the youth, probably high school and junior high age, would go to the best dining hall that served the kind of food they liked. I found this story, this guy said, he was a Nisei, young adult, probably in his early 20s, said, "Fish, fish, fish. I want hamburgers." Yeah, I don't know where the fish came from. Maybe it was canned or frozen or something, but that was his complaint. And they had a lot of vegetable crops. Daikon was the white radish that they really like in Japan. They grew that, and one time they tried tomatoes, but the growing season was too short between frosts, so the tomatoes didn't do real well. But they tried to have as many of the vegetable crops as they could
Correct.
before the crops were in and ready to go to replenish the food supply. They ordered food from wherever they could, and it's shipped in by train or by truck, I'm not sure which.
But all of our friends were Japanese Americans. There were a few white kids, we knew them, but our closest friends were the Japanese Americans that were in our class. And the sliding windows on the barracks let the sand come in when we were having a dust storm or a snowstorm. And we all huddled around the pot-bellied stove, which burned coal. Most of the people from California never burned coal, so that was an education too.
Here is by Mr. Mikami, a well-known artist there in Topaz, and he depicts a dust storm sweeping through the Topaz area. The big water tower in the back is where our water supply was given the pressure to work on the pipes. Trouble is, the pipes were affected by the alkali soil, and they soon started leaking, so they were always repairing the pipes. One of my brother's friends, my older brother Paul, one of his friends told the experience of one time he decided to go with a friend outside the fence at night, climb the water tower, and see Topaz from the top of the tower. So I suppose there is a lot of that stuff going on that we will never know about.
There was a lot of difficulty getting lumber. It wasn't available, and they needed lumber for building hog houses and poultry houses. And so they were able to get scrap lumber by the big truck from a military base near Salt Lake. And it had some 2x4s, but they were only either 2 feet long or 4 feet long. So they would splice them and do what they could. They'd make 4x4s out of 2x4s by using those short pieces. And one University of California graduate learned how to make adobe bricks from the literature. So they made adobe bricks to make the poultry houses. So they had to show a lot of ingenuity. They had trouble getting tools, and they found out the hardware store in Ely, Nevada was going out of business, so they bought everything in a store. And they always had trouble getting enough tools. They needed a lot of workers to do all this work, raising these animals. So they decided that they would use it as a training program for possible employment in the future. And that was a good way to look at it, and it got a lot of people that were interested in farming. And so that worked well, and they found it worked so well, they also used it in the motor pool, the shops, so they could teach people on the job too. People worked in the camps, they worked in the dining halls and maintenance, and somebody got up early and built fires in all the washrooms, because when I went over to take my showers, it was colder than heck in there, but there was a wood stove going. So you know, somebody had to get up early and build that coal fire. In fact, Dad had the second secretary who wanted to work for him, and he says, well, I don't have a typewriter. And she says, I have one, I'll bring mine. And at the hospital, they needed aides, and they trained people for that.
And they were given a very small pay per month. And they could use that pay to buy stuff at the co-op or to order things from Montgomery Ward and Sears Roebuck. The question is, was it voluntary that they worked? And the answer is yes. They weren't required to work, but they could if they wanted to earn a little bit of money. And so most of them, especially the younger people, the older people, the Issei, the original immigrants, they were getting up in years, and some couldn't work or didn't want to work. And so they found ways to spend their time other than going to a job. Yes, Rhonda?
Was that like $1 a day? Did I read $1 a day or something for that?
There were 3 levels of pay. If they were professionals, they got $19 a month.
A month.
That means doctors, teachers, so forth. If they were common laborers, they got $12 a month. If they were in between, sort of with certain skills, it was $16 a month. The reason they set that $19 as the maximum, that was what a buck private in the Army received. And they didn't want any Japanese Americans making more than a buck private.
That's where I got the buck.
Any other questions?
Also, later on, they got passes and worked for the local farmers. And they had to show their passes going in and going out. But all the passes looked the same. Color of hair, black. Color of eyes, brown. I don't know, and there was no picture on there. The people were very stoic. They never complained to us at all. They seemed to make the best of things. And Dad noticed in his report afterwards that they always had an optimistic spirit. That's amazing because they lost everything. They lost property, a lot of them. They lost family keepsakes because they were from Japan, and that was suspect. They lost their friends at home and their reputations. They stayed in a state of strong loyalty to the United States. And many joined in fighting for America. And Ernie already said about the 442nd and 100th Battalion. They bravely fought in Africa and Italy. And they are amazing people. I have a great deal of respect for how they did it. I'm afraid I would have been bitter.
No. My dad worked for a federal agency called the Bureau of Agriculture Economics. And their job was to collect statistics about crops, find the economy of various crops in California. And that was declared not part of the war effort when World War II began. And that office was closed, and that's why my dad was looking for a new job. My mom, pretty much a homemaker in Berkeley. And it was only when we went to Topaz that she started branching out and working for the USO. They had an active USO to give support to the families whose children were whose young men were servicemen. Yes, the question is, how about the social circles of our parents? The main social circle were the other Hakujin administration people, the teachers, the administrators of various departments. And so they'd get together for potlucks and for social activities for the family and for themselves. And there was the relationship with the persons in the camp were more having to do with my mother's involvement at the USO and music. Somebody, especially one of the high school kids, needed a pianist to accompany a musical presentation. They'd say, "Mrs. Bell, could you play the piano while I sing?" She'd say, "Why, sure." There's also a band. One of the pictures that you have there is a jazz band where internees, high school kids who got music together, and sometimes my mom would give them support. My mom was also a pianist for a presentation by a high school choir of the Alleluia Chorus, and so we have a picture of that event as well. There was an interesting need. Evacuees were not allowed to have their cars. They either had to store their cars or sell their cars. And so when they came to camp, they had no transportation. When there was a death at Topaz, the nearest mortuary was in Delta, which was 16 miles away. And when there was a funeral at the mortuary, they needed cars to transport the next of kin, the relatives, to the mortuary and back. And so my mom agreed to volunteer to provide that service. So she would pick up the people, drive them to Delta, and after the service, bring them back to camp. Those are some who give support to the families whose children were whose young men were servicemen. And the servicemen would come back to the camp. They had to get a pass to go into the Topaz to visit their relatives. They had to show the soldiers on guard their pass. I mean, it was just one of the incongruities of that experience. Now, one thing that affected me is how I felt as a minority. So now when I see a person in a minority situation, I have a certain kinship. And I try to think, what could I say or what could I do to maybe help that person feel more part of what's going on. When I was in junior high, eventually I knew every student in our class. There were about 30 kids, boys and girls in our class, and we were like human beings. But I was aware that I was of white privilege. The word Hakujin means white person. And I seemed like I was never quite treated as all the others were. There's sort of a reserve there. And later on, I think of this privilege of being white. I certainly felt that. And my dad was one of the administration that no doubt had some kind of effect on my peers.
It changed our lives, really. It was such an experience that you couldn't put into words, and that it influenced the rest of our lives and how we behaved with others. And you found out that you could learn a lot if you just listened to somebody else and quit talking sometimes.
Pour one down for you, shining on my heart, so you could see the truth and this love I have inside.